I'd like to call this meeting to order, this special council work session on Tuesday, September 22nd. The clerk will take the roll.
Mayor Wolcott.
Here.
Councilmember Tandy.
Here.
Councilmember Hall.
Here.
Councilmember Villanueva.
Here.
Councilmember Biendo.
Here.
Thank you.
Thank you. I suspect the councilman or the vice mayor is on his way, and of course, Councilmember Winters is excused.
Thank you.
So if you'll all please rise and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under
God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. We have a call to the public. Does anyone wish to speak before us this evening?
Yes, Mayor, we have Ken Wright.
Okay. And so before we begin the call to the public, I will tell you that residents wishing to address the council during the public comment period must first fill out a public comment form, turn it into the city clerk. Forms are located at the back of the room. The city clerk will read the speaker's name in the order the form was received. The speaker will then approach the microphone and state their name and address for the record. Each speaker will be allowed 4 minutes to speak. The call to the public portion of tonight's meeting is only for topics not listed on the regular meeting agenda. Per state law, the council members and I are prohibited from responding to issues or answering questions from citizens that are not on tonight's meeting agenda. Therefore, we can only listen to the citizens who wish to address us on non-agenda items. We ask that you be respectful in making your remarks. The council will not accept comments of a personal nature about any individual or group during the call to the public. Anyone wishing to express their personal views about an individual or group may do so in writing and submit their statement to the office of the mayor and/or the city manager. And finally, should a speaker have questions or require any follow-up, I will direct the city manager to talk with the citizen at the conclusion of this meeting. With that, if you would call up our first witness.
Ken Wright.
Mr. Wright. I suspect you know the drill.
Good afternoon, Mayor and Council people.
Could you bring the microphone closer down to you, Ken? Thank you.
An item from several weeks ago, a few months, was brought up, and $2 million was given to the Boys and Girls Club to be used here in Surprise. And that was tax dollars, obviously. And I haven't heard a report on what's going on with our money, and I'd like to get a report. When the gentleman stood up from I guess the Boys and Girls Club, he seemed like it was going to be a fairly rapid process. Blah, 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 let's go get this money here and this money there and so on and so forth. And I don't know what's going on, but as a taxpayer, I'd like to know. And I'd like to see it done in a public meeting. When I read the newspaper this morning, I can read, by the way. Most hillbillies can. It looked like that there's some dilution of the planning process underway for land development. I know there's been at least one major study to get residents' input on this. And I would like to see the residents' input as factored by our council come out into a resolution that somewhat reflects the input that was given. And the article to me was kind of tilted another way. I don't want to see the developers taking the role of the city council. I don't want to see them taking the role of the Surprise Planning Department. And I would like to point out that unrestrained construction during a period several years ago is why a lot of things that can't get done right now, because there was too much money spent, too much helter-skelter construction, and we need to do this right. Basically, that's all I got on that one. Let's please do it right. Let's please consider the public input. And let's please not be led around by the agenda that the developers might have. We need to be independent. I was here at the, or I was here, but I didn't get a chance to speak to the legislative agenda. And I brought this up a year ago. Situations got worse. One of the people from the state in the water, I believe it's the woman that's is in charge of all the municipalities. She wrote to the paper, I have the article, it was about how they had been basically destroyed as far as organization goes by the cuts from in the budget by the governor, and how nothing could be monitored and so on and so forth. The situation is worse than it was, and I guess I'm wondering why groups like this can't get together and get something done on this. Since it's the people at the state that made this 100-year water supply rule up, it's got to go back there. It can't be changed at the local level. So somebody needs to get busy with that. It shouldn't have to wait for the public to do it. That's a shame when it's so badly controlled that the people supposed to do this can't take care of it. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else?
That is all, Mayor. We do have a couple of speakers for the actual next item.
Very good, thank you. So the only item on our agenda this evening,
This is a presentation and discussion of a sign code policy.
good evening, Rick. Good evening, Eric.
Good evening, Mayor and Council.
Thanks for coming back and giving us a little more chance to kind of go over this in greater detail. I know we kind of got into it before, and we do appreciate having a chance to spend a little bit more time. This is kind of an important thing to get it right, so do appreciate your patience with us.
Mayor and Council, you know, it's welcome to the wonderful world of signed ordinance. We call this a design build process, and so tonight's more of a kickoff for a series of meetings, and you'll see that we have an extensive outreach effort along. But before I start tonight, I want to take a moment to thank Robert. Robert got a little ways into his presentation a few weeks ago, and Robert is a resident expert in the stuff. He's done a ton of research. He is the detail guy that takes your policy and puts the details in so we have a usable code. So I want to thank Robert for his excellent work and being an architect in this. So thank you, Robert, very much. So we've had a couple internal meetings as well, because this is very important to the business community as well as community development. So Janine's been involved, Donna from Legal's been involved, and of course Eric. Sign code's kind of an interesting thing. It's okay, it's sign code, what's the big deal? Well, it is a big deal to our business community. And so we have to find a balance between what is for our business community and community development, so we make sure we preserve and promote the character and the quality of the community. So I'll get started here. Okay, so just some of the topics of discussion. I'll just kind of kick it off here, and then Eric can discuss a little bit more in detail. But, you know, again, the purpose is, it's particularly important to the business community. We've heard from the business community that signs are important for their survival of their business in many cases. We've talked about in the general plan where Eric and his team are trying to put in a quasi-form-based or use-based type general plan that will lead to our ability to be flexible in building in character of the community. Sign code is a part of that tool that we can use. It can also play a significant part. Mayor, you've used this phrase before, sense of place. Having a good sign code can create a sense of place for areas. So if we look at the Heritage District will have a sign code, or you have the flexibility in sign code to identify that place. So you know when you come there, you see the signs, it fits the character of that part of our community. So that's a big part of it. So when we talk tonight to council, what we're looking for is really policy feedback so that we can start building this character into the code. So one of the, I'm just going to go through, so the next slide here, why are we doing this? We talk about the purpose. One of the problems we have with our existing code is it's overly prescriptive. In other words, is that it's it's overly prescriptive, but it's too restrictive. It's too restrictive when it comes to placement of signs, size of signs. Electronic messaging on our current code is not allowed. Processing, right now you have to do a formal site plan review, where in many cases this should be administrative. So if we're trying to be business friendly and we're trying to streamline the process, that's something that we think we should look at. Content-based, we've talked about that, the new Supreme Court ruling. And there's also discrepancies within the code itself. So we need to go through and we need to clean that up. And again, the details that Robert's working on along with Donna will help clean up that part. But we put the AZ Tech Accelerator sign up there as an example. So we all know what the current sign looks like. I think that sign that you see there, that it looks pretty doggone nice. Under our current code, that's not allowed. So you have to go through a variance or you have to go a comprehensive sign package. So if it's difficult for us to get through and we have a nice sign, what's it like for the business community? So we want to be able to have that flexibility to build a nice sign that fits the character and not be too restrictive. So outreach is certainly at the forefront of what we're trying to do these days in a number of different areas. So far, we have 28 stakeholders and counting that we've included the sign industry. I think it's the International Sign Association, Surprise Regional Chamber of Commerce. I see a rule is here tonight from the chamber. The real estate community, development community interests as well. And we initially were going to put this on the presentation, but nobody could read it because it's so small. But this is an initial list of people that we have in organizations we've reached out to. And so when we have it on here that's growing, it's continuing to grow. And I emphasize this as a design build process. So as we have these meetings and we have more feedback, we will build that into the code until we get to an ultimate product. And then after we release the first draft, we're going to have a robust outreach effort to all of the stakeholders. So some of our council engagement, if you look at the schedule right here, and Eric's going to talk about this a little bit more, because what we try to do with the sign code is to break it into bite-sized chunks. And we looked at 4 different areas of sign code. So we're not talking about all the signs at one time. We're talking about the specifics. So intro, wall and window signage, monument signs, temporary offside signage. It may turn out that in a future meeting that we might be able to combine both, so we'll have 2 ready at a time and try to get 2 of them at once. But we thought it'd be easier to just go into these bite-sized chunks so that we can really get in and dive into details and get your policy feedback. The schedule there, one note, the planning and zoning public hearing should say 11/12/15, not 9/12/15. But you can see that we have several meetings. I think we've got a total, 6 or 7 meetings total, Eric, including stakeholder meetings, and we're working on a date for that. But we really want to bring in the businesses, the residents, the real estate community, the sign association, and get their feedback because, they live this and, they're experts. So I think I was talking with Charlie just before the meeting, and, he just has, in a 3-minute conversation, he had a couple of really great points about driving down between Scottsdale and Phoenix and see the difference, not only for the signage, but what the development's like on both sides. And I was like, wow, that's a really, really great point. So that's the type of feedback we're really asking for. So I think that the next one here is, Eric will go ahead and kick this off, but he's going to talk a little bit about the 4 different signs chunks that we've broken into, and talk a little bit of detail. If you want to talk more detail, ask that questions. We also have Robert's presentation loaded up if you guys want to dive into that afterwards. I know that we have people that want to speak as well, so we'd welcome that input. It's really at council's pleasure. So, Eric.
Yes, Mayor, members of the council. Was that? Oh, mine's over there. Okay.
I'm doing my Terry Bell.
So what I'll start with is, signs. What are their purpose? Typically, signs are used for identifying businesses, directional, informational, government, institutional. It's to identify those areas of where you're trying to get to. Good signs, convey a very clear message. They're thoughtful, and they're used as accessories to the building structure. Wall signs that you see that actually affixed to the wall should always be either complementing or blending into the structure itself. And when you get too many signs, what you do is you end up cluttering streets or areas, and you get what we call sign haze. So if you look at kind of an example, this would be kind of an example of some sign haze where you have so many signs in such a short area, and they're all just kind of competing with each other. So you as a driver through are basically just kind of ignoring it and not focusing in on any individual one sign. So what we need to do is build a firm but flexible sign ordinance. But that really allows the businesses visibility, but also makes with the character of the different areas of the city, as well as the city as a whole. Also, what we need to consider is signs are a form of speech, which is protected by the Constitution. And the Reed versus Gilbert, Town of Gilbert decision actually reaffirms this, especially when you talk about allowing signage within your public rights-of-ways, and how are you going to regulate that. And so on the first slide, we have temporary signs. As you can see, these are signs from in and around the community. You see some real estate signs identifying for sale properties. You see the snipe signs, which is in this area, which are actually prohibited by our code. You see sandwich boards. When we start looking at currently in our code, we actually regulate what the content is on these signs that are located within the right-of-way, which is actually against what the Reed versus Town of Gilbert decision is, which is one of the reasons we're actually looking at expediting this sign program or sign ordinance. We originally were looking at this, we kind of put it on hold. We were waiting to see what happened with Reed versus the Town of Gilbert. Once that came out, we started ramping up our efforts again, and Rob's been leading that charge. He's done an extremely great job with the stakeholders. He's already started kind of putting together some draft text, so that way we have things to look at, that way we're able to bounce things off of all of our stakeholders. So what we need to really decide, specifically in right-of-ways, when we're talking about temporary sign is, do we allow them at all? Or if we do we allow them during certain types of year? And if we are going to allow them in, what's going to be the time, place, and manner that we're going to allow them at? And what types are we going to allow? Are we going to allow the little snipe sides that are just the little cardboard cutouts? Are we wanting, if we're going to allow them, do we look at more message boards, or not message boards, but sandwich boards, something that looks a little nicer, so that way you're able to, your streetscape isn't compromised from an overabundance of signs necessarily, and different signs that maybe aren't of the same quality. And you can stop me at any time. Another area of temporary signs are banners. So when you look at banners, you have to look at, do you want to start looking at how they're affixed? Do you want to start looking at duration? Typically, banners are used for grand openings, or in the case of a business that maybe hasn't ordered their sign, or their signage hasn't been built yet, that they can at least identify their business, so that way they can bring customers in before their regular signage is up. But again, so you start looking at that, and you start thinking about, well, what durations are we going to look at for a grand opening sign? I mean, you've seen instances where a grand opening sign will sit up there 6 to 8 months afterwards. Is that something we want to allow? Is that something we want to ratchet back? So this is the kind of the give and take of what we're looking at. When I put together the staff report, one of the things I had in there was you can really look at regulating vigorously, or you can look at a more laissez-faire attitude, or meet somewhere in the middle. I'm going to guess that we're going to meet somewhere in the middle with the direction of council, the Planning and Zoning Commission, and the stakeholders. But it's just something to think about. And during this presentation, I'll be kind of posing some more questions to the council about, well, what are you feeling? What are you thinking? So that way we can, when we dive into these individual signage, the wall signs, individual signage presentations, we can bring back examples. We can bring back, those type. We can kind of facilitate more of a conversation in those specific areas of signage. And when you look at temporary banners, you're going to start looking at how they're affixed to the building, where they're affixed to the building. As you can see, we have kind of different ones here. One's hanging down under the sign. This one's basically on a gas station. And then you have this one that's kind of affixed to some of the pillars in the area. And another item specifically with temporary signs is sign walkers. Currently, our code prohibits sign walkers. However, we have not been enforcing that because that's in violation of state statute. So again, we'll be addressing that issue in the sign code, which goes back to some of the issues that Rick brought up, where we have some issues with the law in our sign code, the statutes in our sign code, and now the Constitution in our sign code. So I want to talk a little bit about window signage. So as you can see, we have all different types. Some window signage, there's quite a bit. Some of it, you're seeing very little window signage. So, what you want to look at is, how do you, if we're going to regulate window signage, how do you really want to regulate window signage? There's many different ways you can do it. You can, again, say we're not going to allow window signage, or we can start looking at percentages of the window, area, and number. So, some of the examples I wanted to, and types too. Do you want to allow paint? Do you want to be more poster type signage that's located up there as opposed to paint? So when you look at that, you start looking at how much. So what we've been talking about, internally is, do you look at a percentage of the aggregate window area of a building? Or do you look at a percentage of each individual window? But also what you must consider is that when you have this window signage, we call it, and I know that the police department calls it crime prevention through environmental design, CPTED principles. So what we want to be able to do is make sure that if we have an issue, if we have a robbery or something at one of these businesses, that our officers are able to see in and identify what's going on. I mean, you can make the argument that if it was a blank wall, they wouldn't be able to see it, but we should give them at least the ability through a window to be able to see and ascertain what's going on. So we'll probably be coming back to you on this specific subject with kind of some of the CPTED principles that have kind of been put into that have been put out for reading and so forth, and are accepted practices. So now we're going to move into wall signs. So as I said earlier, when you look at wall signs should really blend in or complement the architecture of a building. So what we need to start, again, I'm going to say this a lot, what we need to start thinking about is placement, area, materials, and illumination, sizing, and so forth. So when you look at illuminations, you have many different illuminations. You have your halo, you have your reverse halo, you have your internal, you have your overhead lit, and I'll be able to bring more examples back on those specific things when we really start diving into those areas. But these are just a couple examples of some of the signage that Robert actually had taken pictures of in Surprise. But so when we start talking about size and number, well, we need to think about, what is that size? What is that number? Do we look at one prescriptive size is going to fit everywhere? Or do we look at different type of mechanisms to allow a deviation from that signage, whether it's design? If we want to control more design, we allow them greater area, greater height. Do we look at it from a facility standpoint? So if you have a business that's located on a 7-lane arterial with a 45-mile-per-hour speed limit, do you allow them greater signage so that they catch people going by than you would allow maybe someone on a minor arterial that at 35 miles per hour, that's more easily seen? Also, what we need to look at on wall signage, and going back even in the temporary signage, is we have many businesses out there that aren't necessarily located along the street frontage. So they have a hard time attracting people into their business. So how do we deal with those? And that kind of goes with the flexibility that we need to build into the sign code, so that we make sure that these businesses are actually viable, that maybe don't have the money to locate right on, say, Bell Road, have to locate a little bit off, but still need to be able to get people to their business. So here's a couple more examples of wall signs. This is the world famous teal arches in Sedona. I believe it's the only deviation that McDonald's has ever had on those golden arches. And so Sedona vigorously regulates their signage. You know, it's kind of interesting. It's the city of Red Rocks, but they have teal arches. I wasn't sure why they didn't just go with red arches. So here on the other side, you have kind of Pennsylvania. There was this. It's kind of more of a rustic signage. It's actually a wood sign with overhead lighting that shines down. This would, for the most part, be dark sky compliant. When I talk a little bit more about illumination, I'll bring up some different examples and that kind of issue. And then you kind of have some big box signage. This is the Fry's Electronics in Tempe, where you have an internally lit signage that's, you know, on a larger building. So they use the scale of the build. You can use the scale of the building to determine the signage that's appropriate for that building. So on-site monuments. You know, as Rick said, when we started doing the review of the Texcelerator sign, I think everyone really liked the aesthetics of the Texcelerator sign, but it was trying to fit it into the code. Currently, we don't allow the electronic messaging. The height was too great. We have one prescriptive height for all monument signs, unless you go through with a comprehensive sign program, which is what we did in this case. And we went through a comprehensive sign program for one sign. So one of the questions that came up at Planning and Zoning Commission was, well, where's the other signs going to be? Because when you go through a comprehensive sign program, and I'll get into that later, you're kind of creating a code from scratch. So you're not really typically doing it for one sign, but you know, you try to make the peg fit in the round hole. So that's kind of the compromise we had. But if you look at what we had versus what we had before, it's definitely an improvement, I would say. And we want to be able to, for other businesses to be able to do that. We have another example. About a couple months when I got it here, Rob had I think a multifamily development come in, and they wanted to improve their sign, vastly improve their sign. And because our requirements were so rigorous, specifically on location, we actually require a 15-foot setback from the property line. That they physically could not make that, so we offered up to run them through a variance process. Unfortunately, they did not want to go through that process. But I don't blame them. It's another public process. It's more money out of their pocket, more time out of their day. So, you know, it's those types of things that we really want to fix. You know, and so when you talk about that, what's that appropriate distance from the right-of-way line? Is it 3 foot? Is it 5 foot? Is it 10 foot? Is it still 15? The other item of, you know, when you look at our sign code currently, the way it's built, it's fairly hard to interpret in certain aspects. And specifically on that item, the setback, it took us 2 hours. We were running around, we were going through the ordinance for about 2 hours trying to find that setback. It was buried in another section of the code at the bottom. So we want to fix those types of issues. So and again, you know, this is very similar to wall signs. How do we look at? Do we want to do one prescriptive size? Do we want to look at the facilities they front on? You know, do we want to look at the design specifically? Do we want to make deviations that, hey, here's our minimum, here's our max height and max width, max area. But if you're willing to work with the city on the design of the site, you'll get this much more. Actually, Charlie, when we brought that up specifically, the city of Phoenix does that. And so I think it's something we definitely should look at, because if we're talking about form-based, you know, looking at the form of buildings, we should be really talking about the form of the form of signage as well, because they are an accessory to that building.
Councilmember Hall?
Thank you, Mayor. Yeah, Eric, I was going to bring that up. You know, signage can be an amenity, visual amenity, and that's why, you know, like this multifamily you were talking about, probably one was being on it to identify in the windshield, but also to have their residents feel like they're a sense of place with this sign, you know? And so we really need to be, not only look at the setback, but what does the sign look like on the street? You know, the permanent sign I'm talking about. And so I'm glad you're looking at that, because I totally agree with it, Eric.
I think you make a really great point about, you know, form. And if we're going to be focusing in on form, then we need to make certain that the signage matches, because otherwise it's sort of a disconnect, and it looks like a piece of married furniture. It doesn't quite fit.
And you know, and you know, bridging off of that, Mayor, you know, we look at a lot of the signage and how it's regulated. It's basically regulated into a box. And I'm not wanting to pick on Peoria, but I mean, you could probably see this anywhere. You know, brown, some stone, little accent piece. You know, we want these sign companies to be able to be creative. I would venture to say, you know, really on the Texcelerator side, I think that's a creative use of signage. I haven't seen a lot of that. So we want to be able to work with those designers to really come up with something that's unique. And that actually catches people's eyes, because that's what your whole idea, that's what the whole job of signage is to bring people into your business and identify where you're located.
I look at the one in Mesa, and there's a whole different reason for having something like that, because it's a character piece that has historic value, a sense of place that was created quite some time ago. And I know that when we went through the sign on the nursery out on Grand Avenue, we sort of went down that same road about trying to create a character sign that was actually relevant to the area where the business is located. So it's more than just the form and function of the actual business there, but it was actually the neighborhood that that sign is in. And we certainly talked about it forever. So I think we finally got a nice result. But I personally, I love signs like this, because they really speak to our heritage and our past, and I think that's great.
Yeah, there's actually quite a few of these down, and you know, Donna can definitely speak to this down Mesa Drive. They have the one that with the hotel where they have the person diving into the lake or the pool and stuff. And there's this one I used to frequent as a kid, and my parents used to take me there all the time when they had like the sawdust on the floors and so forth. So the stuff like this kind of just, you know, you're right, it's just kind of reminiscent of, you know, where you were. But so, you know, you know, one of the reasons to show you this sign, these are kind of one extreme, like you can have the Bill Johnsons with the lights and so forth. At this point, maybe that's not appropriate for certain areas, but maybe it's appropriate for other areas. You look at the Peoria example, it's more of an office complex, typical office complex signage. And then this is a Texas example of, I would call it more of the big box type facility, where it's fairly large, doesn't have a whole lot of tenant space, but it really doesn't have a whole architectural appeal either. I would say, you know, the Peoria one, you know, would have a little more architecture to it. The Texas one looks a little more plain straightforward. And that kind of speaks to when you start looking at the design elements that you want to stick in your sign code, I think you really want to leave those elements fairly open. You kind of want to guide the size, and you kind of want to allow for the industry and for the developers to be able to kind of come in with creative ideas. And I think one way you do that is kind of through, you know, as when we were talking with Charlie, is if you're going to come in with a better design, that's something that you'll work with us on collaboratively, then we're going to allow you a little bit greater height, greater width, greater area. I think that's kind of that meet in the middle conversation that you need to have. So freeway monument signs. Oh, sorry.
Councilmember Hall?
Thank you, Mayor. Eric, before we leave that, you know, the first sign you brought up, which is the Fry's Center, and I think you had Jim's Burgers and Eggs in there, whatever. It looked like, if I remember, it was like 4 tenant signs. There's probably 8 tenants in that shopping center. I'm just wondering if we ought to give them the opportunity to have every tenant have a sign on the big sign. You know what I'm saying? Just so that, I mean, when you're driving 35 or 40 miles an hour, you don't look at the sign all the time, but every once in a while, if you're going to Fry's, you're going, is there a cleaners in here? You know, that kind of question, or another convenience, and that sign would be helpful, you know, and it'd be helpful to them to build their business, you know? What do you think?
Mayor Wilcock, Councilmember Hall, definitely. Currently within our code, and I'll look back to Rob to make sure I'm 100% correct, we only allow about, if you're coming in just straight for a monument sign, we only allow 6 reader panels per side, I think, as a maximum. So you're only allowed 12. So that's one of the things we need to address. If you have multi-tenants, and say maybe that development didn't come in for a comprehensive sign program, which actually in the comprehensive sign program, it doesn't only allows you so many of those reader panels as well. which I'll get into the comprehensive sign program a little bit later too. We want to make sure that there's enough flexibility so that everyone can have signage, but it's not, and it's not overly, ridiculously looking, if that makes sense. So, and I think you work with that through the form of the sign itself.
Councilmember Biondo?
Thank you, Mayor. These two examples, the Mesa and the Peoria example, I think are such striking examples for a couple of reasons. Obviously, that overriding concern is what best fits the character of Surprise. And as one, at least as I look at those two, it reminds me of the fine line between tasteful and gaudy. And where do we want to come down on our signage? What best fits the character of this city? Is it the more colorful, the more dynamic, the larger, et cetera, as the Mesa sign, or is it the more tasteful, more conservative with a little C type of sign as the Peoria sign? And I know that's a difficult place to identify, but in the final analysis, I think that's where we need to be in our discussions about which and what are those dimensions and what are those colors, and without going into all that specificity, all those things that fit the character of Surprise.
And I think that is a great point. I don't know what the vintage is of the Mesa sign, but I suspect it's not recent.
Yeah, probably.
But that doesn't mean that somebody couldn't replicate something like that if, in fact, we weren't very careful about making certain that that type of signage fit in with a certain character area or village plan or whatever it is we decide to call it at some day down the line. But it is a fine line. And I think that's why we talked about it so much on the sign, the windmill sign, the Moon Valley sign. My goodness, we spent a lot of time on that sign. This council would never have any time to get anything else done if we didn't get the sign code right, because if we spent all of our time spending that much time talking about each individual sign, and we would also have a staff that would be challenged to stay up. But I think that Councilmember Biondo raises a great point about the fine line between those two examples. I personally would not want to end up on the side of ubiquity, so that it's just so boring it has absolutely no character whatsoever. And but by the same token, I think we want it to be tasteful, and I think we accomplished tasteful in our windmill sign. Took us a while, but we got there.
And I think that Thunderbird Common sign, it didn't even pass the test of being readable.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a basic. Be readable.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
And
for one thing, it's the lettering, the white lettering on the beige background. You can't even read that. The other thing is the issue of, you said there's current sign code allows total of 12 panels on six on each side. And is there any restriction on whether or not they both sides have to read the same, or so that's a management decision. That's a decision of the property owner as to how they want to divvy up the signage then.
Yeah, I'm guessing, Mayor will call it, I'm guessing what typically happens on these is that so the owner will own the signage, and then if the entity wants to put like one of the reader panels up, they'll usually require them to pay that. And maybe if Charlie comes up here and speaks later, you can totally say I'm wrong, but they'll contact the sign company to make up their rendering of it, put it on, and maybe they charge them a rent fee or something like that, similar to what maybe we do on our kiosk program, so we charge the businesses so much, or we don't charge, but the entity that runs those charges the businesses located there so much a month. That I'm not too sure of. I've never really been involved in that portion of it, but I would imagine something similar.
So this particular Thunderbird Common sign would not be legal here because there's more than 6 panels on one side.
It would not be legal.
Okay. Councilwoman Villanueva.
I wanted to ask you, it's been a long time since we've been talking about the entrance to the city signs. and it just seems like it was dropped. Are you gonna go through that as far as the entrance to the city signs, or is that something different?
Mayor Wolcott, Councilwoman Villanueva. Basically, where we're at now on that is they were instructed to come back with another concept. I know Mike Boulay, who's kind of running that project on the CIP side, has set up a meeting for Thursday to kind of roll out that new concept. We had 4 concepts total. We told them to take one off and go back and bring back one more. So as far as I know, we're meeting on Thursday to discuss that. So it hasn't stopped.
Okay.
Thank you. Councilmember Biondo.
Thank you. Just one other quick thing. When you were mentioning banners, I assume then you'll also talk about such things as fixed awnings, where awnings are fixed, and then have the actual signs imprinted on those fixed awnings that sometimes roll up at night and sometimes don't, and also this whole issue of balloons and inflatables.
Yeah, Mayor Wolcott, Councilmember Biendo, yes, those will be addressed as well. And when we get into the individual kind of next 3 meetings, we'll be able to dive into those a little bit more. So those items will be brought up. So then you talk about freeway monument signage. You know, this is actually a good example of when you start looking at a facility, how do you catch someone's eye? One of the reasons these freeway monuments are so large is that you have your public traveling at 75 miles an hour, so you don't have much time to really catch their attention. So again, with these right now, I think it's the Prasada PAD specifically speaks to a couple locations of these freeway monument signs, and they're kind of done through PADs. This goes back to the processing that Rick was talking about. Currently, we go through a site plan type process to approve any of these. Well, you know, as was brought up, you know, if you have a small business owner, and they want to stick a monument sign on their property, you know, they have to come in with a full site plan and have that location. Well, what if that site plan no longer exists? What if the entity that actually, submitted it doesn't have the drawings? They have to go in and commission a whole new site plan just so that they can show, okay, I want this monument right here. So we need to look at those processes and how we approve them. We need to look at, another process is the comprehensive sign program. So when you start looking at freeway monument signs, how do you really want to, and these are on-site signs, at least on-site of the development. How do you want to look at number of reader panels? Do you want to allow large electronic messaging on those large signs? If you do, what's the height? What's the size? What's the feel of them? Do you look at the same thing that we talked about earlier, where if you're going to work with us on design, we'll allow you more reader panels, or we'll allow you a little more sign area or a little bit greater height. It's those types of conversations that we'd like to be able to facilitate with the drafting of the sign code, as well as going through the process and permits of these signs. So I'm going to talk a little bit about electronic messaging. This is something I'm definitely not a expert in, but we have the ability, and we would actually link the electronic messaging up with the monument signage. We have the ability, his name's James Carpentier. He's like head of governmental relations for the International Sign Association. We had a meeting with him probably about 2 weeks ago where he offered to come up and give a robust presentation on this at one of these work sessions. So if it's something the council wishes to have, we can definitely facilitate that. He's an expert in his field. He knows what he's talking about. He's got it's almost like a electronic messaging sign 101. Here's what they do, here's what they are, here's what they can do. I'll briefly go through some of the items with you, but I would really, once we start scheduling these dates, I'd like to reach out to him and to come in and really kind of give you a presentation so that maybe it brings a little more comfortability with maybe allowing these signs, because they're useful to the businesses in the city.
Right. And I remember council members, some of you were on council at the time, and I know that Roy Villanueva and I both kind of spoke up about some concerns about light pollution and the kind of light noise, essentially, that's created in certain corridors. And what was discussed at the time was there's a development agreement that allows a certain number along the 303 corridor. And I think that's something that we need to include in the conversation. What does the development agreement allow? And do we intend to change that at all? Do we intend to work with the developer about changing that? I'd like to know a little bit more, not just about location and how many it's allowed, but what is the size allowed? What is the amount of light that is allowed for a digital billboard? That would be helpful to know.
And you know what? I have a couple of those numbers actually in here. But again, I think James would do a much better job articulating this. So as you see, here's a couple examples. There's many different capabilities. One of the things is when you first started to look at the first iteration of these signs, they were very loud, they were very in your face. Since that time, with some of the regulations that have kind of come forward, they've been quieted quite a bit. They still provide the function of a sign, but they don't have necessarily the light pollution that maybe was in the past. So I have one of my examples is I used to drive the 10 back when I worked in Gila Bend, and there was one of the auto stores, the Tempe Autoplex, had a massive EM board, and they would have lightning bolts come out. It would light up the whole, all of I-10 across, and it was, that was a little distracting, but it was, it's those types of things. It was interesting.
But creative.
Yeah, it got my attention, that's for sure.
Councilwoman Villanueva.
I wanted to ask you, people that have these signs already, are they going to have to replace them if there's a change?
No, they would, Mayor Wolcott, Council Member Villanueva, no, they would not have to change. They could keep them as long as they're operable and
they're
the business
already
is
there.
going. Yeah.
Okay.
It'd be like and even so, if the idea was we're not going to allow them at all, these would basically be legal non-conforming uses. There's only a couple. If you look at the freeway signage, that's actually along the 101. The Valero is down the street, I believe. So again, there's all kinds of different capabilities with these signs. The ISA actually has, in his presentation, he talks about that one sign. You always have that one sign that's the thing that, creates, we need to stop this, we need to regulate it, we need to make sure that doesn't happen again. But I think just focusing on it, and that goes back to kind of that first iteration of those electronic messaging boards, is, that was the one sign, but they've made improvements, the quality and so forth. When you look at these, and typically when you kind of go through and looking at how the different cities regulate, they'll regulate size, they'll regulate timing, they'll regulate brightness, and so on the brightness piece, the ISA has kind of a model ordinance where they say typically it should be no more than 0.3 foot candles above the ambient light. And what that means is if you're in a darker area, it should be dimmer than if you're, say, at the auto mall where it's a little bit brighter. You would allow a little bit brighter in there. Verifying that on a code enforcement, and code enforcement would be pretty tough. But I think it's a good way to at least attempt to regulate that if that's something we're going to entertain with these electronic messaging boards. Again, they have some model language of size. They have some model language of the foot candles. There is some model language specifically, towards other areas of the sign of the code itself. But so this is something that, again, I think bringing James in here to give you guys a robust presentation would be very, very helpful. And we've talked, and it'd be about 30 minutes or so. We just would have to coordinate with his schedule. He'd need to fly from DC out. Billboards. As Mayor Wolcott was saying, we have billboards. We have a few locations where that was in a development agreement along the 303 where we're supposed to allow some billboards. Off the top of my head, I couldn't tell you exactly where, how, when, size, so forth. But again, when you look at billboards, when you're looking at regulating them, I think you need to allow them to an extent. However, right now, so the city of Glendale is going through a scenic corridor plan where they're actually going to basically along the 101 from about where Bell Road is, give or take, all the way up through their city limits, where they're not going to allow. I don't believe they're going to allow billboards at all.
Is that along where they're contiguous with Peoria? North.
Yeah, I'd have to look it up again to be absolutely certain. But I know it's the 101 corridor, and it's basically kind of where that mountainous area there along there within the Glendale city limits.
Okay.
So they're going through that process as we speak. So when we look at these area number, do we allow them aesthetics? Do we allow the messaging boards? Do you want the static boards? If you do allow the messaging boards, you start looking at, again, going back to the electronic messaging section, what's the foot candles, what's the duration? Again, there's some industry standards on all those. What's interesting on the messaging boards too is that when we went through the comprehensive sign package on the Arizona Texcelerator, what they said was the new ones, the Decatronics, which is the vendor that's providing ours, actually automatically dims at night, and you as the owner can dim it yourself. So if you start getting complaints, you have control of it enough to where you can dim out the amount of foot candles that are coming out of that electronic messaging board. So illumination. So I kind of started talking a little bit about this. You have many different types of illumination: external, internal. Again, the sign code does not allow neon or LED. I would say, I think there's places for every type of lighting. So maybe that's something we look at. And then right now, if there's any exposed neon, we have to cover it by plastic. As well as, right now, we actually regulate the fact that if you want to run like LED or neon lighting around the building to accent features, we regulate that as of now. Do we want to be regulating that? Is that something we really want to get into? Or is that something that more or less should fit more into when we go through the site plan process and the elevations? Just something to think about. Here's a backlit halo. This one was up here specifically giving an example, but also talking about when we do this sign code, we need to start looking at how are we looking at the development signage as well. Where's the appropriate place for that? Typically, we work through those in PADs. A lot of that's kind of settled through that process. Or in my past, we've actually done it through comprehensive sign programs as well, where you show your monument signage, you show your other signage within the site, and so forth. Flags and flagpoles. Yes, we regulate these. So is this something we still want to be in the business of, or do we kind of create a laissez-faire attitude where it's something that's kind of that's basically on the owner himself for the flags that they want. In the communities I've worked in the past, typically you'll have a height limit and a number limit. Something else that we need to roll into the overall sign code. And then here's my favorite one, the comprehensive sign program. What is this? A comprehensive sign program is basically a sign ordinance for a specific site. Typically, the way the comprehensive sign program is in an ordinance, it will have kind of the requirements of what you submit and what you regulate, but it leaves you open between the staff and the applicant to come up with the appropriate regulations for that specific site. So, example, Belgrande, the town center. Town center has a comprehensive sign program. They actually have the heights, the areas, number, locations, all determined in this program. It is basically the sign ordinance for that specific project. And a lot of times what they'll do too is, our code does not, is they'll say you must have at least more than one sign to be able to have a comprehensive sign program so you don't get around the process, which is kind of what we did on our own. So when we look at this, it's almost like its own little sign ordinance for that individual entity. So what do we look at how we process those kinds of things? Is it administrative? Does it need to just go to the Planning and Zoning Commission? Should it go to the Planning and Zoning Commission and be reaffirmed by the City Council? Those are the items. Currently, our comprehensive sign program is so restrictive, it's almost useless going through one, to be honest with you. It's really restrictive on the height. You're only allowed to increase area by 50% of the maximum area. I'm getting that right? And again, the reader panel piece, the reader panels are pretty much set in there. So what we want to do on the comprehensive sign program is we want to write in there the requirements of submitting one and I think the items that we want to see, but we want to be able to have the negotiation back and forth with these larger developments to actually have to basically look at the design. Okay, if you're wanting this, then we're going to want this. Very similar. We want to build the same thing. I think we want to build the same things in the comprehensive sign program that we want to build into the overall sign code itself. Another item for consideration is Belgrande with the construction. I wanted to bring this up. This isn't specifically just for the sign ordinance itself, but we really need to think about, okay, during construction, what signage are we going to allow? We're going to need to allow some directional signage for these businesses during the construction, during, how long, for the duration. Where are we going to provide those signs? What are those areas? Do we look at kind of creating a sign overlay district in this area, specifically because, with where the overpass is going, we're going to have some businesses that aren't going to be able to be seen as well. Do we create a comprehensive sign program for the whole intersection or portions of the intersection? These are the items that we need to have more of a discussion with council on in the future. And I think this is actually even separate than the sign code itself, because we need to do something in interim and we need to do an ultimate solution for these businesses in this area. And with that, I think what we wanted to do was, open up to council, but we also wanted to open up to the public to come up and speak, and so, thank you.
Council members, Councilmember Hall.
Thank you, Mayor. Sorry, Eric. Going back to, you talked about the type of street. That's an interesting approach that I was thinking about too, is that maybe the type of street drives the kind of signage. Temporary. Talking about temporary signage. So maybe Bell Road, there's no temporary signage on Bell Road. I'm just throwing this out. But you take a minor arterial, and maybe that's where we allow temporary signage. But because after a while, I don't know about you, but driving down Bell Road 45, 50 miles an hour, you just disregard all those signs. You don't really engage. You just see the sign, and it's just. So I was just trying to think, if I was a real estate agent, why would I want a sign on Bell Road? Or even Reeves, really? Because people are going to be looking for a neighborhood, so wouldn't they get, Todd can probably speak to this maybe better than me, but it seems like if you're looking for a neighborhood, you get into a minor arterial area or a collector, and that's where the signage really becomes relevant, not on the high speed. Anyway. That was.
Are you suggesting more like on a main road like Bell, you would have more of the pylon signs or the signs that have 6 to 12 panels for the businesses?
Well, yeah.
Permanent signs, not temporary signs.
Right. That's what I'm talking about, Mayor. I'm talking about the temporary signage.
Right.
Yeah, and then back to the. This is just me. I'm just giving you feedback. Everybody else can give feedback too. Is the window sign of the restaurants, the fast food restaurants specifically, the Burger Kings, the Taco Bells, whatever. It's so important, but I think they overdo it. This is just me. I don't really, as customers, you can just be inundated with 7 or 8 of these panels in a window. Maybe I think we take the aggregate window and say a percentage of that, because it gets back to the design for the police too. I don't know, you're driving by as a policeman at 10 o'clock at night and whatever, if they could be robbing the place, you wouldn't even know it. You can't see. They can't see in there. So anyway, and then on the, here was another thing. Somebody opens for business, right? That we give them a promotional period to really do some neat things, to draw people to their business, to build trial, okay? And then I'm just thinking out loud now, is maybe there's a time of year where we have a re-promotional time by areas of the city. In other words, what I'm thinking is, if we have 125,000 people in the city, there's going to be a certain percentage that move out and move in to a city. So you're going to have potential new customers. So if there was an annual promotion time where we gave them a time to really do a promotion to build trial again. Because once Joe Cleaners is next to Safeway and he does a great job, you don't need the signage anymore. Visually you drive by Safeway and it's right there by Safeway. The signage becomes subordinate. okay? But to build trial, that's very important for businesses. And that's just a thought. I don't know what anybody else thinks, but just, anyway, that's my thought. The setback requirement, that's something that's just, I agree, we really got to look at that. You know, that's just, and you know, I don't know how to do this, you guys, but I think when we get into an area where it's a real problem, for instance, this multifamily developer or whatever, they get into a problem, I really think you ought to bring it to the council while we're going through this time period. Let's say a developer walks in tomorrow and he's got this issue with signage. Rather than sitting on this, well, we're reviewing our sign ordinance and then, what does that mean? 90 days I don't get a sign or something? If there's a problem, what if you just brought it to council and showed us pictures? Here's what they want to do. Here's the ordinance, but here's the variance. You guys got a problem with that. And you know what I'm saying, Eric? I would just hate to put a kibosh on people trying to get signage done. That's just me. And I love the sign overlay district. I really like that because there are areas of the city that have distinct attributes, and signage fits into that. So I like the overlays approach. So good job. That's my feedback.
Councilmember Biondo.
Thank you, Mayor. The mayor raised this point earlier, and it's really an intriguing point, I think. Do we know how many existing developments have internal sign restrictions that may or may not be consistent with the city restrictions? For example, the whole auto mall area out there is the prime example, where they have some pretty rigorous, as far as I can remember,
The CCNR, right.
yeah, some pretty rigorous sign restrictions for all the occupants there at the auto mall. And I don't know how many other developments there may be that may have those same types of internal sign restrictions, and how do we create some consistency between and among, if that's even possible, and I don't know. But obviously it's a good point that the mayor raised earlier, and something we really need to look at.
And is there, to that point, is there a kind of a general rule of thumb that the individual developer, if they want to be more restrictive than the city, should not that be their option?
Those are
And
good
I mean,
questions, yeah.
honestly, I think a lot of us are very grateful to Mr. Razor that
Yeah.
we don't have gorillas
Yes.
and giant Gumby
Right.
men with flopping arms out there on the new 303. I think it sets a much better tone for what we're trying to accomplish out there in our employment quarter. So
Yeah.
that's a good point.
Yeah, I think that's precisely the point, and trying to figure out how our sign code juxtaposes with theirs. And
Right.
they don't necessarily have to be the same, but I think you have to look at that so there's not just all this random stuff going on. On one other quick subject, you mentioned flagpoles earlier. It was very interesting. Sun City Grand, by the way, wanted, and I don't think they've done that yet, but they were exploring the possibility of putting a flagpole up at the Cimarron Center. And as they began exploring that, among other things, there were standards about the platform on which the flag could be mounted, and then concerns about fire access. Is that in a place that might obstruct where a fire engine would have to be there and make a turn? So I think it's a little more complicated than just, can you put a pole up or not? I guess my inclination would be that maybe the city ought to have some sign regulations about flagpoles. When you ask the question, should we or shouldn't we?
Yeah.
Councilwoman Villanueva?
I'm a little concerned about the development on Bell Road and the businesses, to let them know what they're going to be able to do with signs for their businesses ahead of time, because that's going to be real devastating to them. If we could figure out what they're gonna be able to do to advertise their businesses, even before the development comes in. Because I think it's so necessary to keep them and to let them know, to give them, even if it's just that area, that we are different, you know, for their businesses, to make sure that people know that they're there. If that's going to happen, to make a decision on what we're going to do ahead of time and let them know. That's how I feel. We don't want to lose any of those businesses. We can't afford to.
We do not.
Thank you, Councilwoman. Councilmember Tandy.
Thanks. I'll start off my comments by some observations I had at your land use planning get-togethers with the stakeholders and the residents. And one of the things I heard was people like variety in this area. So that's kind of a guiding principle for me. Quality is the other thing. I encourage you, I like the idea that you're reaching out to the sign industry, you know, and looking at model ordinances for, you know, kind of base points, because, you know, the sign industry evolves, and, you know, there are new things out there that we should stay current with. I also really like that you're going to engage the stakeholders from the businesses, and one thing I'd encourage you there is they might even want to come up with some ideas how to make it a quality presentation themselves, and what kind of restrictions they'd want to self-restrict. You know, what is that right balance for signs in the windows for the fast food restaurants? They might have an idea once they hear all the different options, and maybe they can self-guide and at least give us ideas what they're interested in, with the guiding principle that we want quality and we want it to make sense for our residents and make sense for the businesses too. Another point, you know, that we don't allow LED lighting, and, you know, that's kind of odd for me to hear that. I don't know what the reasons would be, but again, you know, now they have people called lighting architects, and we can get some really good quality benefits, I think, in the community if we open our eyes to at least maybe that possibility. I really like the idea that was mentioned many times, character-based, especially in a certain area. So you mentioned that one, Philadelphia, it's a wood sign. I think, you know, a development with that would be really nice, but it wouldn't go throughout the whole city. With that, though, I'd also kind of like to have you guys think about how you would transition from something like that to something quite a bit different than that. So how do we do that? And, you know, does it make sense that we keep Bell fairly consistent, because that is the place of surprise? Or those are my thoughts. Getting on to real estate especially, because it was brought up that, you know, do different neighborhoods have different regulations? Sun City Grand actually does regulate the real estate industry a little bit different. They had to go in and replace all the temporary signs and also the signposts, because they restricted them to a smaller size than was allowed previously. So try to find out all of that, you know, so that, you know, people don't have to buy 5 different sizes of signs, and what makes sense for the community. I think the Sun City Grand standards are, you know, I think they'd be okay, but maybe the designated brokers of some of the offices wouldn't like to do that citywide. So I'd weigh heavily on their input for how that works. I think those are my comments so far.
Vice Mayor?
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you for the presentation. I like the idea of the packaging, that grand opening packaging, that special circumstances, to kind of get the word out. We've talked about this a lot through the Great Recession, and really went laissez-faire, because you had a picture up there of the bike shop sandwich board. I guarantee you that they could put a dollar amount that sandwich board brings to drive-by traffic on Bell Road into that small business. I'm glad we're looking at stakeholder conversations, because I couldn't put a finger on this. I can't start regulating signage because it's going to be important for various businesses to have certain signs that they can afford, that they know will draw in traffic, whereas some of those monument signs are monthly fees that some of these small places, these pocket stores embedded in these strip plazas can't afford because they're barely making rent right now. So I'm glad we're going through the stakeholder process because it's going to be really important. You got to hear what's going to be important for everybody, and then make some decisions. I get it. I know we got to put a finger on it, just for the aesthetics of our community. It goes back to those surveys where we're a clean community, and that's something we're known for. I'd like to be known for more than just a clean community, maybe a community where small businesses can thrive, where I don't have to drive all the way to downtown Phoenix to find a niche store to get a bike fixed or to shop for anything. To think of something that we don't have in Surprise, and there's a laundry list. So I just don't, I'm very cautious going into this process. I'm glad we're having these conversations. It's, I apologize to staff for it taking so long and having to come back 2 or 3 times to talk about this. But it's appreciated because I think we just got to be cautious on how we do this. And even billboards and monument signs. I think the fear, Councilmember Tandy, in the past, Mike, what I recall for LED signs and those was we don't want to turn into Vegas. Well, we're probably not going to turn into Vegas, but that was part of the conversation. So I think kind of dismissing that and having those stakeholder conversations are going to be really relevant and important, and we'll get to a place where aesthetically we can fit our needs, but also not cannibalize some of these smaller businesses that rely on some of the signage that you see when you drive down the street, in windows, sandwich boards, those kind of things. Thanks.
I really appreciate the conversation that we're having here tonight and the feedback that you're getting. And a couple of points, Councilwoman Villanueva is talking about the entry monuments, but we also had talked about monuments scattered throughout the city. And the last time we had a major council workshop to sit down and kind of talk about that, we even identified where we might want to put them. And while it is a separate issue, it isn't, because we're really setting a tone and we're kind of setting a practice as well, because look at what we just talked about. First thing you had up here was the Texcelerator sign. So what the city does matters. And so I want to make sure that we are consistent. The monument and kind of those street identifier signs throughout the city is really important, and I've seen where it's been managed beautifully in other cities, and they've done an excellent job. Obviously, Goodyear comes to mind. They've done an excellent job of putting in signage in such a way that it's tasteful, but it still identifies a sense of place. It's done very well. For years, the fear about lighting pollution has been on the minds of a lot of people, as we are at the very edge of development out here, and we're looking at the White Tank Mountains, and we don't want to obliterate that beautiful view. And I remember Roy being very concerned about that and talking about how he didn't want to see that view spoiled with light pollution. And I know that there are folks that have open spaces and farmland out there that are equally concerned about those kinds of things, and so we need to be sensitive to that. It's a difference, though, when you stick an LED sign 85 feet in the air versus an LED sign that's down at at eye level as you're driving. I've seen some beautiful signs, very tasteful LED signs that have been done at basically the pedestrian level, and it isn't contributing to light pollution. So we need to be sensitive to all those things, and we also need to know what we've already obligated ourselves to through the development agreement. So that's something that I'm very concerned about, making sure that we are consistent. the other piece is, again, when you have a developer who really wants to self-regulate, we don't want to get in conflict with what they want to do. Because I really do appreciate the way our auto mall looks. I think it looks great, very professional, looks super. So anyway, very well done. Thank you for putting this piece together, just kind of kick off the conversation, and we look forward to the feedback from the rest of the community as we go through the process. Councilmember Tandy, did you have another comment
Yes.
you wanted to make?
A little bit of clarification on when you reach out to the store owners, and I would recommend that maybe you get the advice of the local store manager, but also reach out to the owner or the regional directors of the bigger stores, because they're going to have a lot different thought, I think, about, you know, for instance, I know the owner of the Burger King. They have very good confidence in the manager of that store that you had in the photo, but I'm sure they'd want to weigh in on that. Same thing with regional director of Walmart. You know, I'd like to reach out to them at least, because I think it's that important, and we might get bigger ideas and bigger solutions. As far as the LED, just clarification on that, I wasn't really thinking big billboard LEDs. I was thinking more, there's a lot of, like the Asante sign. I look at that and it's a very nice sign, very well thought out, but you can see the reflections of the individual lighting. Whereas an LED, you could actually blend it in and not see that, and it could be a much more quality effect. So that's the type of look I'm looking for.
Councilwoman Villanueva.
The reason that I brought up that particular area is because that's the only area that's going to have a 30-foot bridge that's going to affect their business. Mm-hmm. And I think it's very important that we really look into that. I mean, that's the only area, and not only that, but that's our commercial area. That's our only big commercial area that we have at the present time. And I think we need to work with them a lot sooner than later. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. So I think that's it from the council. We do have members of the public who wanted to weigh in this evening. So Sherry, who do we have visiting with us this evening?
Yes, we have Nate Brill.
Good evening.
Hi. First off, thank you very much for discussing this. I'm with the real estate community, so I'm a realtor. I live here. I work all over the valley, but because of the fact that I live here, it is especially important to me. It's probably about 30%, 40% of my business is here. I really want to address the fact that we in the real estate community are businesses, and I feel like that sort of gets lost in this conversation. To address your point, Representative Hall, regarding major intersections, those are the lifeblood for us. My business, I track my numbers very, very seriously. I know my numbers, and my numbers are about 40 to 50%, depending on the year, of my business comes from open houses, directly from open houses. So open houses for us, they serve two purposes. They serve the purpose of selling the actual house that we're in, and there are a lot of real estate agents who will say that they're a complete waste of time to even do open houses because they don't sell the house. Well, that typical real estate agent is only putting out 3 or 4 signs. And I can tell you that 3 or 4 signs will get you maybe one person. You might get the direct neighbor. Whereas if you do put out 20 signs, you put out 25 signs, which I know on the surface sounds like an awful lot. It isn't. We are a transient business. We move from one place to the next to the next. We don't have the options. We don't have the, like you were saying, once you go into a shopping center, you know that so-and-so's cleaner is there. People don't know where we are. They don't know where we are unless we put out the signs to do so. So we've got to have signs, and take an intersection like Litchfield and Bell. You know, if we're going to be over in that general vicinity and we're trying to pull traffic from anywhere over there, we can't just have one sign. Otherwise it does get lost. You know, and so that's where we're trying to come from our side, because it is, to me, what I always tell people when I'm talking with other real estate agents who are trying to get into doing open houses is that, to my mind, in this day and age that we live where the human connection is lost, I think people crave it more than ever. And for us to have that human connection where we're trying to stand out above a Zillow type of contact, where there is no person to person, the best way for us to do that is with open houses. And so again, for us to get people into our open house, for us to be able to, like for me, I've lived in Surprise since basically the very beginning of what Surprise was. And so I can talk about Surprise. I can speak very highly of Surprise because I love this city. And I can talk about the development that's happening. And I get people who are driving through to go to Vegas. I get people who are driving just because they've got friends out in the area, they've got family out in the area, and I can speak to them about the city. And I can talk about it because I've gotten them in the door. And so I have sold a number of homes to people who were not even looking to be in Surprise because I'm able to say this is the best value in the entire neighborhood, in the entire valley. And so I'm only able to do that because I've got them in the door. I think that's just about everything that I wanted to cover with you guys today. I really hope that when we start talking about temporary signs, that we can be involved. And I wanted to make sure you had my card too, because we are stakeholders. And as our industry goes, there are two segments of the real estate population. And unfortunately, about 75 or 80% of that population is just people who happen to have their license. For those of us who are doing this as a business, this is of the utmost importance to us. So that's what I've got.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The next speaker is Leo Mankiewicz.
Good afternoon, Madam Mayor, Council. Boy, I just hear you guys talking about how this city should look. I'm just verklempt. You know, it is wonderful to hear you guys talking about it. Great comments by all the council members, very insightful. I know you guys are interested. I love this discussion because this is where you incubate your form-based code. This exercise that you're going through right now, and thank you very much for great presentation, sounds just like the one you're going to have someday when you talk about either a particular character district or something. Well, what should the buildings look like, you know? And one of the important things will be what predominates, the buildings or the signs. So this is a good time to sort of think about that stuff. To Councilwoman Villanueva's point about that the intersection of Bell and Grant and that very big thing that's going to go there, and how it has the potential of just really overwhelming that corner and those businesses. A great way to spotlight that corner is for council to somehow dig into your pocket for the $1.5 million that you have to add to that art project that can go there. A world-class piece of art there. People will come there just to see that. People will come there just to drive over that thing. It's a major consideration. When they were building the Statue of Liberty, we got the statue for free from the country of France, but there was a big hullabaloo about the base and how much it costs to build that base and that park on that island. And oh my God, it's so expensive. Well, we all know how that ended up. If you allow electronic images on signs and things, that's a great thing to be able to drill down into, because you'll find a way to sort of regulate that and how it's already been done, how many, how frequent the messages come. I like some of the existing signs we have right now, the monument signs in particular, because they seem to be no taller than the buildings around which they are. And of course, the big exception to that is the Winco sign. I drove down the highway today and I noticed that sign is positioned so that me in my car way down in the bottom of that highway, which is, I don't know, 30 feet below the rest of the street level, I can see that sign from a good mile away. Now, so it works for me from that standpoint, but then I'm driving down Bell towards the mountain, and I used to see this nice unbroken mountain range, and now it's broken by this great huge sign. So it's there. We should be sensitive to those kind of issues, because especially on the 303. I love the fact that Glendale has proposed a scenic corridor. We can maybe do the same. There are existing agreements there now, but it would be a great idea to do something like that. Signage is going through a lot of metamorphoses. We can look into the future. You know, someday we may have something like transparent billboards that can come up and bring a message up but then disappear. So let's not rush too quickly to put things in place just because somebody wants them. Let's let the designers loose and become a place where they can really bring their great designs. I believe that illumination of building outlines should be allowed, but only at Christmas. The window signage in the fast food restaurants, I think that is it's gotten out of hand. It didn't used to be that bad. We can cut that back, and we can use a public safety reason to do it. So it's very good to dive into the detail here on these signs, because you don't need to regulate the whole spectrum of things, but you can get rid of the junk. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
That is all that I have, Mayor.
Thank you. Well, that being, you do have a wrap-up?
Yeah, Mayor, just a very quick comment.
Okay.
As far as the stakeholder engagement, as you can see, that's kind of a central point of what we're trying to do here. If you look at the schedule, it does say stakeholder meeting, but we have multiple work sessions that's all stakeholders are welcome to come to. And I just got Eric's permission that if you can't make one of those meetings and you still want to have input, that you can contact Robert directly. We'll make him, sorry, Robert, you can get a lot of phone calls, but he can take your input and make sure we have that feedback if you're unable to make a meeting as well. So we want to make sure that that's important. In the future meetings, we kind of see going through each one of these bite-sized chunks like you're going to an optometrist. You know, like this better here, better here, better here, better here, so we can dive down and get, you know, as we go through that design build process in constructing this code.
So what's the plan for getting the word out as to when and where the public can come in and weigh in on the sign code? You know, obviously communicating with them on how they can participate is really going to be key.
Good evening, Mayor, council members. I had envisioned that once the language was in a draft format, that we would let the stakeholders know and maybe put it out on the website and say, here it is, and then allow them to react to it. But in terms of timing, I think the slide was, I'm sorry, mid-October. Yeah, mid-October. That was our hope.
Mayor, could I ask a question?
Yes, Councilmember Hall.
Thank you. Rick, what about the website? Getting comments on the website about this new sign, where people, if they miss a meeting, they can give you input or the website.
You know, if Diane's willing to help us out, yeah, it'd be great. You know, her team's pretty spectacular, but
You get the thumbs up.
we got thumbs up. We got thumbs up from Diane, so yeah, that we'd be more than happy to do that. And, you know, again, the idea is to get all the feedback we possibly can, so we can build a code that, you know, embraces what everyone sees. And I have to say, council, thank you so much for some really, really good initial feedback. You know, it's very, very helpful. And
I think it'd be helpful to get this chart on the website, if we can just get this chart up someplace so people can see when things are going to be happening, and people can participate. I mean, obviously, if they're going to be coming to a public stakeholder meeting, we need to know when and where, and we want to make sure we get the best possible feedback that we can. And you know, it's not a usual Tuesday night for us to have people in the audience, but it's really nice to have you here. So we really do want your feedback. We value your feedback, and it's really important for us to get this right. I think John said it, you know, best. This is all about the stakeholders. This is their lifeblood. The signage is going to be their lifeblood.
It is. And I was just thinking, Mayor, maybe there's don't we have a mailing list of all the shopping center owners or the management companies of the shopping centers? I'm wondering if we ought to reach out to them to alert them too, because if I'm a property manager of a shopping center, I'm going to want some input into this.
Right.
Don't you think? And I'm going to let my tenants know that this is being talked about.
Right, you know, and for example, Mayor, Councilmember Hall, you know, Councilmember Villanueva mentioned a couple times her concern over the Bell Grande area and making sure that they have appropriate signage and input, and we deal with that sooner or later. So one of the things we would do is probably talk to CBRE right away, and then they have asked them to help us reach them as well and we've had some discussions with Tori as well. So, but absolutely, we'll reach out to everybody we possibly can.
Okay.
And if you think if we've missed one, please let us know. We'll go get it.
And Mayor, Council Member, so this is a tentative timeline. These are our target dates. However, you know, things are fluid. Things can move back. You know, if we need to do some more engagement, we can do that. Again, these are tentative. They're not set in stone. So we want to be open and transparent.
Okay. Anybody else? Rick and Eric, thank you very much for you and your staff and for all the work that you've done putting this together. And it's great getting off to a great conversation. I really appreciate the feedback from all of our council and all of our members of the public that have come forward this evening, and we encourage more of it in the future. So with that, I don't believe we have any executive session, do we? Nope. So I will entertain a motion.
I make a motion.
Second.
Motion has been made and seconded that we adjourn this meeting. All those in favor, please signify by saying aye. Aye. This meeting is adjourned.